Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Giles Gibson. Let's take a look at your latest headlines. Sources say Saudi Arabia is planning to host a Chinese Arab summit on the 9th of December, with Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly set to attend. The European Union is considering setting up a special court backed by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. The Eurozone's annual inflation rate falls to 10% in November. That's compared to 10.6% the month before, the first decline in 17 months. The French baguette, one of the country's most iconic products, has been given World Heritage status by UNESCO. And in sports news, England roar into the second round of the FIFA World Cup after a 3-0 win over Wales. We begin with a major breakthrough in medical science, and a drug has been proven to slow cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients. Scientists have been trying and failing to achieve that for several decades. Preliminary data from a trial of the drug lecanemab showed that it slows cognitive decline by 27% across an 18-month period. Scientists, though, whose research was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, say the drug can have, quote, adverse effects in some patients, including brain bleeds and swelling. About 17.3% of patients who received the drug showed a risk of brain bleeds and 12.6% a risk of brain swelling. Despite those side effects, though, in some patients, the director of the UK's Dementia Research Institute has described it as the first drug that provides a real treatment option for people who are suffering with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's accounts for nearly 2/3 of the 55 million people around the world currently living with dementia. It's the leading cause of death in the UK, with patients dying on average within 7 years of a diagnosis. The drug lecanemab is extremely expensive, though, costing between $12,000 and $36,000 US per patient per year. Moving on now, and the UK could be facing a shortage of turkeys ahead of the festive season. According to industry leaders, half of the free-range turkeys that were reared for Christmas have either died or been slaughtered because of the ongoing bird flu epidemic. That means that 600,000 birds have been lost. The highly infectious bird flu has been affecting the UK for more than a year now, and the outbreak has picked up pace in recent weeks. Since October, there have been 136 confirmed cases of the highly pathogenic avian influenza strain known as H5N1, out of which the vast majority have been here in England. According to the British Poultry Council's chief executive, more than 35% of poultry farms have been affected by some form of control designed to curb the spread of bird flu. Right, joining us for more details on this story is our London correspondent Alex Izat. Alex, tell us some more about what the impact on businesses has been of this ongoing avian flu outbreak.
Well, as you say, the flu outbreak has been going on now for nearly a year. There has been restrictions in place throughout the year. Usually, in the past, we've seen this rise of avian flu across all wild birds and also poultry farms around August time due to migratory bird reasons. But this year it just hasn't gone away, and it is becoming worse, and it's an endemic, as Zephyr have said. But of course, this particular incident where the turkeys aren't going to be available for Christmas are only on free-range farms, and that's with farmers who allow their birds to go outside for a certain amount of time. So not all birds are going to suffer, and there are still 11 million turkeys available for those in the UK if they do want one for Christmas. But the really sad news is that when one bird potentially gets the avian flu and the symptoms are diarrhea, they stop eating and they become lethargic and don't produce eggs, if one bird gets it within a farm, then the whole flock will have to be put down. So for some farmers, it's devastating. Many farms across the UK have had to close their doors. Of course, we had not long ago an egg shortage too, and that is also caused by the fact that we have a reduced number of birds. There really doesn't seem to be anything that can be done at the moment. There are some vaccinations on trial in places like China and the Netherlands, but they haven't been brought to the UK yet. And there's also talk of genetically engineering birds at Edinburgh University, but that then also opens up a whole different dialogue. Right now, there is a real worry, not just for turkeys for Christmas, but ongoing for all free-range animals. And if the free-range birds aren't be allowed to go outside, they now have to be locked indoors, then we potentially may see an end to free-range birds at all.
And Alex, you mentioned DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs here in the UK. How have they been responding to this outbreak so far? And as you say, is there much that they can do about it?
Well, throughout the year, DEFRA have been making sure that they go into farms that have any signs of bird flu. And not just farms, they've also been going to any areas where they've seen wild birds, ducks specifically, who have died. And then they have been testing them and then making sure that all of the farmers in the area are aware of what's going on in their location. So what they've been telling people to do, if you have any animals, to keep them inside so that they don't have any access to other wild animals or birds, and to be really careful, be a biosecurity when it comes to feed. Some of these birds that have been indoors still have bird flu, so there is a real concern about exactly how is that getting in, and it could be due to the process of getting that feed from wherever it may come from. So they have to be extremely strict, but this is also costing a lot of money for those farmers, and DEFRA are trying really hard to stop this getting even worse and going through to yet another year. But they, as I said, they can only do so much, and farmers are also trying to do as much as they can as well for their livelihood, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That was Alex Izat joining us live from London. Let's get the latest on the war in Ukraine now, and NATO allies are pledging to assist the country in repairing its energy infrastructure as winter sets in. Russian attacks have severely damaged Ukraine's power grid in recent weeks, with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, accusing Russia of using winter as a weapon of war. Here's more details on that story.
NATO has pledged to boost its support to Ukraine. It announced on Tuesday that it would help Kyiv rebuild energy infrastructure that's been heavily damaged by Russian shelling. That's after NATO's chief said Moscow was using the winter cold as a weapon of war.
Russia is using brutal missile and drone attacks to leave Ukraine cold and dark this winter.
Russia has been carrying out heavy attacks on Ukraine's power grid almost weekly since October. Kyiv says it's a deliberate campaign to harm civilians and calls it a war crime. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly accused Putin of trying to freeze the Ukrainians into submission.
I don't think it will be successful. In fact, I know it won't be successful because they've shown a huge amount of resilience, and we will continue to support them through these difficult months.
Russia acknowledges attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, but denies deliberately seeking to harm civilians. Meanwhile, soldiers on the ground in Ukraine say they're starting to struggle as winter begins to bite. Heavy rain and falling temperatures are making conditions even grimmer along the front lines.
What can I tell you? We're more or less okay. But it's a bit harder now because of the rain and a light frost. It's a swamp. You can see it yourself. It's dried up a bit today, but it's okay. We're holding up.
Some military analysts say they expect Ukraine will try to keep up the pressure on Russian forces over the winter to prevent them from digging in and settling.
Preparations in Ukraine there for the onset of winter. Let's move on to some other news now. And for the first time in Australian history, a former Prime Minister has been formally censored by the House of Representatives. Ex-PM Scott Morrison has been censored for secretly appointing himself to several key ministries during the COVID-19 pandemic. The historic motion brought by the governing Labour Party censored Morrison after he took charge of 5 ministerial portfolios during the pandemic when he was still Prime Minister, namely Health, Finance, the Treasury, Resources and Home Affairs. By a vote of 86 to 50, lawmakers decided that Mr Morrison's actions eroded public trust in Australia's democracy and made proper accountability impossible. Take a listen.
He owes an apology to the Australian people for the undermining of democracy, and that's why this motion should be supported by every member of this House.
Now, Morrison, who is still a member of the Australian Parliament, was in the chamber for much of the debate, and he firmly defended his actions during the pandemic. Take a listen.
I am proud, Mr Speaker, at a time of extreme trial, my government stood up and faced the abyss of uncertainty that our country looked into, and the coercion of a regional bully, and saw Australia through the storm. Australia emerged stronger under my government. I have no intention now, Mr Speaker, of submitting to the political intimidation of this government using its numbers in this place to impose its retribution on a political opponent.
Morrison did, however, admit that he had some misgivings about keeping his appointment secret, but he also claims that if he had been asked by journalists that he would have made this public. Take a listen.
Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that the non-disclosure of arrangements has caused unintentional offence and extend an apology to those who were offended. But, Mr Speaker, I do not apologise for taking action, especially prudent redundancy action in a national crisis in order to save lives and to save livelihoods.
Now, this is the first time that the former Australian Prime Minister has personally commented on this controversy since his actions were first exposed back in August. Before this debate, he had released 2 written statements through his lawyers. Mr Morrison's actions were ultimately found to be legal, but his use of extraordinary ministerial powers to block a major gas project is now being challenged in the Australian courts. The former Prime Minister has rejected calls to resign from his seat in Parliament. Meanwhile, the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, says his party will now try to change the law to ensure that ministerial appointments have to be made public.
He owes an apology to the Australian people for the undermining of democracy, and that's why this motion should be.
China's nuclear arsenal is likely to triple by 2035. That's according to a new report released by the Pentagon in Washington. The report also highlighted the increased sophistication of the country's air force. According to the US military, China is expected to have a stockpile of 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035 if it continues at its current pace of nuclear expansion. The US Defense Department says that could impact regional security. Take a listen.
The challenge here is the more proliferation there is, the more concerning it is, the more destabilizing to the region it is. So certainly we would want to ensure from a regional, global and regional stability standpoint that we can maintain an open dialogue to ensure there's transparency and that we understand what the intent is behind this.
Now, even if China manages to build up 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, its arsenal will still be smaller than those of the United States and Russia, which have several thousand at their disposal. China says it's ready for dialogue about its nuclear expansion, but there is a condition that the US is prepared to reduce its own nuclear stockpile down to China's level. The Pentagon also says that China is working to modernize its ballistic missiles, which are capable of delivering nuclear weapons. The report says that China launched around 135 ballistic missiles for testing and training in 2021, which it says is more than the rest of the world combined. That excludes those fired in conflicts. It also underlines that China's air force is, quote, rapidly catching up to Western air forces. Let's get some business news now. And weighed down by COVID-19 curbs and slowing global demand, China's factory output contracted at a faster pace than expected in November. This latest economic data underscoring the increasing pressure on the world's second largest economy. The official Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index stood at 48. That's compared to 49.2 in October, the lowest reading in 7 months. Separately, the non-manufacturing PMI, which looks at the service sector and its activity, fell to 46.7 from 48.7 in October. That's also the lowest reading in the space of 7 months. The 50-point mark separates contraction from growth on a monthly basis. China's economy, which is already under pressure from a property slump and also weakening global demand for Chinese goods, has experienced a wider slowdown over the last few months, especially in October, adding to concerns about growth in the last quarter of 2022. Now, Chinese authorities have rolled out a series of measures to try to boost economic growth, including reserve requirement ratio cuts and COVID fine-tuning measures, while also loosening financing curbs to rescue the struggling property sector.
This T1, T2, and this telemetry, and this is the tower train off, which is our reception tower.
Let's cross over to Africa now, and the capital of Kenya's population has doubled over the last 20 years as a result of new townships which have sprung up, which are, according to experts, poorly planned. They often lack light and proper infrastructure and also sanitation facilities. However, the Kenyan government is coming up with an innovative solution to all of this. The country is trying to build a smart city which will be designed to promote a sustainable lifestyle. Take a look.
With urbanization, Kenya's capital population has grown rapidly. In fact, it has doubled over the last 20 years. Due to such a high population density, buildings have been built very close to each other to accommodate the ballooning populace in Nairobi.
The building is quite big and we have to use the electricity throughout the day because we can't manage to do anything here without the lights. So when the power is out, we ought to turn on the generator because that's the immediate alternative that we have. And we can't use the solar panel because the building here is much congested.
Many new satellite neighborhoods have sprawled around Nairobi due to overpopulation. That too with very little planning or regulation. As a result, many residents struggle to receive even a shred of natural light and have to rely on light bulbs most of the day. The sewage in these neighborhoods is also mismanaged. Rainwater is left to run down the streets, often causing floods and overwhelming the sewer lines.
Here where I live, there is a problem with light. Even if you open the window, it does not let the light in because of the congestion. There's a problem when it rains because we don't collect rainwater, we use borehole water, and there's a problem with sewage.
To overcome these problems, the Kenyan government is planning to build satellite cities from scratch. And this time around, they intend to keep environment in mind. One such project, called Konza Technopolis, is already under construction. The upcoming smart city will feature sustainable architectural designs that factor in rainwater collection and use solar power. It will spread over an area of 5,000 acres and will be developed in 4 phases, from residential homes and affordable student accommodation to commercial buildings and technology hubs. Developers say the smart city will cater to both ends of the market.
For ensuring that water is consumed adequately, we ensure that the buildings are designed with sensors in the flushing of toilets and also in the washing of hands. For this, we also encourage water harvesting, especially during rainy seasons. We have storage tanks under there so that you can pump them up and they can be used for flushing of toilets.
One major challenge that the engineers face is the sustainability of construction materials. The material used to build a city must be green with low embodied energy. The Technopolis has set aside green spaces and has adopted green building practices, which are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the city and ensuring a clean environment. These include sustainable use of water, clean, efficient and renewable energy, clean sanitation and proper waste management.
There's a lot of timber that is used for shuttering, for use for construction of scaffolds. Our approach to ensure that it's sustainable, we have multiple use of a simple resource such as timber, so that rather than using it for a single use, it is reused for a different application, as mentioned.
According to the United Nations Environmental Programme, real estate accounts for up to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But smart cities like Konza Technopolis can be a big step towards sustainable living. Neighborhoods planned from the outset to allow for energy efficiency, space and quality of life are very rare. But the Kenyan government says it wants to build more. Bureau Report, World of Africa.
And that's all we've got time for today. Thanks very much for joining us. Stay tuned to WION for more news from around the world.
There are many other